so good.
Okay, you guys can see my full screen? Yes. Okay, we'll see what happens when I do Slido later. Okay, so today is June 29th, and you are here for the SF mug on personalization in Marketo from one-to-many to one-to-one. My name is Amy Goldfine. I'm the Senior Marketing Operations Manager at Iterable, based out of San Francisco, although I am zooming in from sunny Marin County, California. My pronouns are she, her. You might notice this big red circle here. That is because Lauren sadly has moved on. She's moved away from the Bay Area and moving on to bigger and better things. And so she has stepped down. So I am looking for a co-leader or co-leaders. So if anybody's interested, please hit me up, because I don't have anybody who's interested yet. So although really I think maybe this is the first time I'm telling everybody, I was pretty sad when Lauren stepped down. But you know, I get it. So yeah.
Anything you can share about where she went onward and upward, or?
She moved to New Mexico, I think. So
that sounds good.
Yeah. So,
I'd like that.
Yeah.
I thought you said upward.
Oh yeah, sorry, outward, eastward.
Maybe she's at a higher elevation.
Yeah. Yeah, her
Did
family.
She move out of a marketing platform?
No, I think she's still a try.
Oh.
But yeah, her family like moved out there, so they were out there temporarily and then decided to move, just stay there permanently. So, anywho, yeah. So enough about me. This is not about me. Let me see if I can go to the house rules. As you all know, this is a user-focused group and a safe space for the Marketing Nation. So no self-promotion. Do not contact people outside of the user group without their consent. And if someone shares their use case, please don't share that information without their consent. Couple of more housekeeping things from us and Adobe. If you are not in the Bay Area Marketo users Slack and you would like to be, please send a direct chat to me with your email address and I'll add you. It's a great way to chat with everybody, talk about upcoming meetings, talk about use cases, just chit chat with other members, etc. I find it a really good way to keep in touch with many of you. So yeah, just Slack me your email address. I promise I will only use it for that one thing. Now, the thing I wanted to mention is if you are registered for this event, double check that you're actually a member of this mug. You can register for a mug event without joining. And if you don't join the mug, you won't get regular invites. So just go to mugs.marketo.com and the San Francisco chapter. I will pop a link to that in the chat in a minute. But just make sure you click the little join us button. And if you need to get certified for Marketo for the expert level, if you are recertifying or taking it for the first time, you should know that there is a new exam. So the old exam, which used to be called Marketo Certified Expert, and then they ported it to the Adobe system and has been the exam we took it anytime before this month. You can still take that. That is AD0E552. You can take that through the end of the year. But there's a new exam. It was developed with a bunch of Marketo champions. I have not taken it, but many people say that it's like a little more tailored to the actual like Marketo administration and daily use experience, and less things that you could just study for if you studied really hard. It's really like based on a lot of like your daily use, and that is AD0E554. I will obviously send out this deck afterwards. I will put this link in the chat as well. You do not have to memorize this, but just know that there is a new exam, and for the next 6 months, you could take either. Any questions about certification? Okay. And if you've been to SF Mug before, you may have used Slido with us. It's a really great way to ask questions. Please feel free to chat. I love when people have like an active chat going on in these meetings, but it's really nice to put the questions into Slido because then they don't get lost in the chat, and then you can actually go and upvote other people's questions. So the really popular questions will surface to the top, and we can make sure to answer those first. All right, without further ado, I'm going to pass over to my friend Phil Wild, who is going to take it from here to talk about personalization.
Thank you, Amy. let me just share my screen. Hopefully everyone can see that okay as well.
Yep.
All good? Yeah, okay. Thanks everyone. Let's talk about personalization in Marketo. Big topic. And as Amy said, if you've got any questions throughout, just go to Slido there, pop them in, and hopefully we can address a few of those before the end of the presentation. So just the first starting point, who am I? Why am I talking about this? I'm a senior advisor at the Lumery, which is a marketing technology consultancy in Melbourne in Australia, despite my beautiful Bay Area background here. And we basically advise on people, process, data, and technology to build that internal capability around things like personalization at scale. I'm lucky enough to be one of the Marketo champions for 2021, which is how I got this opportunity. And I do advise any of you, if you're thinking about taking the next step in your career and you're very comfortable in Marketo, have a look at applying for the champion program, as well as helping out Amy with the San Francisco mug. She obviously needs a co-organizer at the moment. Quick little bit about the Lumery where I work. We basically use technology and data to bridge that void between brands and customers. So brands want the Netflix, like Amazon-like experience. Brands want to deliver those experiences, but as we all know, the MarTech stack and the MarTech world is incredibly confusing. We try and demystify that a bit for our customers. Okay, that's enough of the sell job. So let's talk about the opportunity initially. Well, we all sort of see these stats going around saying how personalization increases X by Y and how for every dollar you spend, you're going to get this much out of personalization. So I don't think we really need to be sold on the idea that personalizing to customers is effective. We see from the likes of Amazon and Netflix and even Facebook to many extents that personalizing what a person sees to their situation and context is incredibly effective if you get it right. But the problem we have is that when you look at those experiences and the ones that come to mind for people when they think about personalization, think, how could I ever get to Netflix levels of personalization? How could we ever do what Amazon is doing? So one of the things we're going to talk about today is how we actually break that down, and you won't get to anything like Netflix overnight, but how can you start to attack that in small steps and build? So we like to think about personalization in terms of a maturity scale, and you can actually do this within the segment of email marketing or really any channel. The first one is obviously not personalized at all. The next one would be one-to-many, where you have macro segments that might be male and female. Then you will have something like one-to-few, micro segments. Maybe there's dozens of segments or even hundreds. And of course, the holy grail there is you get to that segment of one, the one-to-one experience. So when you map that against Marketo, you can think about that really in terms of the functionality of the platform. Not personalized as your batch and blast. We're all very familiar with that. One-to-many would be using segmentations and dynamic content to personalize. One-to-few can go to velocity scripting. And one-to-one would either be Marketo's predictive content or potentially outside external vendors. It's not perfectly going to map to that in every situation, but it's generally a reasonable way to think about the level of sophistication and maturity you've got within your personalization program in Marketo. So let's talk through those different stages one by one. One-to-all with batch and blast, pretty familiar for most of us. This is not really where you want to be, but there's absolutely times that this is appropriate. And I won't spend any more time talking about that because that's pretty basic functionality within Marketo. One-to-many. So this is where you're probably using segmentations and dynamic content. So a good example here would be maybe you want to build out different email sections based on a CX persona. So in terms of pros and cons here, well, it's relatively simple to set up. It's not very technical. When you start using Marketo, you can read a few of those docs and probably pretty quickly work out, all right, here's how I build a segmentation and here's how I bring it to life with dynamic content to give those different experiences for users. So it's something that your non-technical marketer can generally set up and get going without too much trouble. In terms of cons though, some of you might have run into this. I know I did early on in my Marketo career. You can only have 20 segmentations per instance. And they're actually really annoying to wind back if you have used those 20 segmentations and you need to remove one and add another. You need to remove every reference to the segmentation and every email you might have used it in or what have you. So definitely not a path you want to go down without thinking too much about, all right, what are my key segmentations we're going to be using over and over again so that you don't build 20 different one-off pieces and then you don't have any room for any more. The other part is that each segment needs to be built out manually, and there's diminishing marginal returns with that. So your first split of male versus female, that might be, all right, pretty easy to do and will give you a good 50-50 split. But as you continue to build out different segments within that segmentation, you're going to go to smaller and smaller slices of the population. So if you're building out a different segment for, let's say, 18 to 20-year-olds versus 20 to 22 versus 24 to 26, you're going to start to see diminishing returns as you cut those pieces smaller and smaller. But the amount of effort that you're putting in to build out the segment is actually the same. So there'll be a point where it's not actually worth the effort anymore for the increase you get. So here's a quick example of how this could come to life. Amy was kind enough to share me a couple of screenshots of her segmentations here. So one for dreamers, one for builders. This is a segmentation set up in Marketo, and it's varying the email image on the header based on what a person's persona is in Marketo with that segmentation. So moving on to the next example here of one to few with velocity scripting. And velocity can really build more scalable solutions. The pros here is that it's much more complex criteria. When you're writing email scripts, you can, instead of just being limited to the filters in Marketo, you can start to do fancy things like calculate fields, access custom objects in Marketo or potentially in Salesforce or Dynamics, and use that to build out the different experiences that a person will see within an email script token. There's also no limit to the total number of tokens that you can have. So unlike segmentations where you only have 20, you could build out hundreds or even thousands of email scripts. It might cause your emails to slow down a bit when they're sending, but it is technically possible to do it. But probably the real power of this is that it can actually be overwritten at the folder or program level as needed. So let's say then that, taking that male versus female example again, you wanted to have a default footer image, which is maybe a man or a woman. You could have that at a top level folder in Marketo, which then inherits all the way down like a regular token. But for a one-off campaign, you might decide, you know what, we want to use different imagery for this footer. And you could override it just for a specific email program while leaving everything else intact. So for segmentation, you can sort of do that, but it's a little bit more work and you sort of have to change around what you're actually doing. So that's an easier way to say, as with all tokens, you can actually inherit that all the way down. It's quite handy. So velocity scripting email tokens will give you a bit more flexibility in that way. In terms of cons, well, it is still manually built. You still have to, as we've got on the right here, say for this particular group of people, show this. So that is still going to be something where you see those diminishing marginal returns as you go along. It's quite technical. It's not something where you're going to be able to immediately go in and understand what's going on. Velocity scripting is sort of notoriously difficult to get into. So it doesn't have that sort of smaller barrier like segmentations might. And it doesn't have any machine learning or any automation sort of built in there. You still do have to tell, this is the output that I want for each segment. So an example of that might be, well, we've got this dreamers and this builders segment in the last example. Let's say that we actually built out ones which had bought something and ones who didn't. I've only put 2 different segments here, but there could be 20 or 30 different segments that see different experiences here. And we might just list out the articles that they get in a different order or different articles entirely based on the output of that email script. So that's email scripting and velocity scripting. On to one-to-one. So one-to-one in Marketo is generally done with something called predictive content. And that actually goes across email and web. So you can actually show the best content for each person on a one-to-one basis in both those places. So the pros of this is that it's infinitely scalable. You basically have to spend time building out the content, but whether you've got 100 people that goes to or 100,000, it's actually going to scale perfectly across that with no extra work. So theoretically, every one of those 100,000 email recipients or web page visitors could have a different experience. The cons there is that it is an extra cost. This isn't something that's included for free in the regular sort of Marketo packages. So you have to decide whether that's going to be worth the investment for your company. And it is time consuming to set up and maintain. How this effectively works is that if you launch a new product or a new blog article, you have to go into the predictive content module in Marketo and say, okay, here's a new piece of content. Here's the title. Here's a URL. here's a label, and here's actually like the image I want to show when it's being shown in email. You have to set all that up. And then from there, Marketo will say, this is something that can be personalized and brought into a dynamic block within Marketo. So if you have 1,000 different articles, you'll have to do that 1,000 different times, which is a lot of setup work. The results will be really great in one-to-one, but there is a lot of investment initially to get that going. This is an example of how that could come to life. Instead of talking about segments which are based on personas or demographics, we're actually talking about people now. So person 1 might see article 11, article 2, and article 32. Person 2 might see 3 completely different articles, and that would be the same across the entire database. So we should also ask ourselves a question, well, is Marketo the right place for one-to-one? And there's always a decision to be made here, because if you did have 1,000 blog articles, then the amount of time to actually set that up and say, all right, we're going to tag all of these so that they're displayed for these one-to-one experiences, it's going to take a really long time. There might be other tools that might make more sense to streamline that a bit. And other tools might also go across more than email and web. There are other vendors in the space that might say, well, we'll personalize for email, web, maybe even next best action in your Salesforce instance. So when somebody calls up, your contact center staff know what to talk to people about. So for the larger teams in the enterprise, it might find that Marketo might not be able to get all that context it needs, and it also won't be able to talk to as many downstream channels as you might want. So just something to think about as well. So that's all very well and good to say, well, here's how we go from one to all to one-to-one, but really, how do we bring that personalization to life? And I know there are a few questions, even just on registration, saying, well, where do I begin? How do I determine what the best value for effort is? All these different sorts of questions, because with many of these things, the functionality isn't actually the hardest bit. It's the same as when you buy Marketo. Like buying Marketo or going out for the RFP and so on isn't actually the hardest bit. The hardest bit is bringing it to life and building the structures and processes within that to be successful. So let's talk about that a bit. What we've basically done at the Lumery is create this operating model for personalization, and it's around 5 different pillars. It's actually agnostic to any sort of channel or output. So it can work across email marketing or web, or even just across all of them at the same time. And what it does is give you a framework to think about how you can actually start to scale personalization, and an approach to give that sort of perspective on where your time might be best spent. So I'm going to talk through that. The first of the 5 pillars there is context. So why are we targeting triggering something to a customer? Like what are they doing right now? Context could be something like they're on their mobile, they're viewing an email on their mobile. It might be something like on the website, they've logged in and they're looking at your product page. It's effectively like what's happening right now. So the next one is audience. This could be something where you're talking about demographics or personas. It might be something where you're looking at their age, or it actually might be that full one-to-one experience where you're talking about a segment of one. So having that information will also make sure that you can personalize to a person's, to give that person the best experience. The third one is treatment. So this is the image that they see, the copy that they might see, any other pieces about the experience. So you might say, well, we want to personalize based on, again, maybe male or female or personas. That might require different web banners, different email banners. There might be 5 or 6 sizes of those, and that's something you have to take into consideration when you're thinking about building this out and scaling it as well. Fourth piece is next best action. So what are we actually trying to achieve for this person? So for some people, you might say, well, because you just hit the website and we know nothing about you, the next best action for you is to get you to subscribe to our emails. But for somebody who's already subscribed, that next best action might be to give your sales team a call. So you can decide what makes the most sense for this customer. And there can be some decisioning that goes into that, whether it's automated or manual as well, to actually determine personalized output based on what's best for that person. And the final one is next best offer. So this is something where you might actually decide to vary the incentives for a person, or even just your CTA based on what you think is going to resonate best. So to go back to some of our previous examples, well, you might decide that for men, you might want to show a percentage off, whereas for women, you might want to show the dollar sign off. I mean, that may or may not be effective in actually getting them to take the action you want them to take. So this is a piece that maybe isn't utilized as often within a personalization framework, but for some companies that are quite advanced, this is the territory they start to get into, trying to vary the CTAs, to vary the actual rewards to get that action. So those overall are the 5 different pillars of personalization and how you can think about building out what a personalized experience should look like. So where we can go to next and use the framework is to actually use those 5 pillars to work out what's an experience that I would like to personalize for my audience. So to start out there at the top, we've got context of mobile. Down one level, we've got an audience. Let's say it's a prospect from San Francisco. In treatment, maybe we want 2 different image treatments. Maybe we want one which is a picture of a bank and another one which is a picture of the Golden Gate Bridge. For the next best action, maybe we want them to complete, like maybe it's complete a profile or complete their registration. And for the next best offer, let's say that we've got 2 CTAs here for a potential bank. There might be direct debit or there might be no account fees. There might be 2 different ways of trying to incentivize that action. So when you look at something like this and we've mapped out that sort of user flow, it sort of tells you a couple of things. One is that, all right, well, how many different permutations are there? How many different ways can a person go through this flow? And what does that actually mean for my creative requirements in many ways? So if you saw here that there was, instead of 100 different permutations, and you might think, okay, well, do we want to bite that off? Can we actually make all those different creative outputs? Can we make those different experiences? That's sort of telling you about the level of effort to actually implement it. But what it's also doing is it's breaking it down into something more manageable, because now you're not talking about this Netflix-like one-to-one experience, which is machine learning and teams of data scientists and so on. You're actually talking about a real user story of somebody going through your flows, experiencing your brand, and how you can make that just a bit better for them. So if you were starting at that one-to-all level, then maybe you want to start through this and say, well, I want to build a different experience for people who are prospects versus customers. And you can work through this model to say, what should that experience look like? Work out any blockers if there are any and build that out. So the flow, or the sort of steps to go through this and work out how you're going to get that value from personalization and start to build it, is to start with that sort of brainstorming. Like, what are some user stories which could be helped by personalization? And whether you start off using that previous framework or whether you just talk about those different pieces in a room, you'll notice that if you talk to your sales staff, for example, there's customers who have a particular situation they're trying to solve or a particular problem they have. And there's different pieces of creative or maybe different outputs that you could use to address that need. That's where you'll start to see, okay, well, here's an opportunity for personalization to solve a particular problem with a particular group of my customers. So once you've gathered all those different user stories, you can actually start to categorize and prioritize them. So those things like the amount of effort, the potential uplift and ranking and so on is something that's really important to do, because we all know that like not everything needs to be one-to-one. And some of the things that you think might be important and might make a difference actually might not in the end. So what you can do to actually bring that to life is, if you actually have, let's say, an email campaign, and I've had this situation in the past where one of your managers might say, oh, we should do a different version based on, these people versus these people. It's actually pretty straightforward in Marketo to run the numbers in the database and say, well, that segment you're talking about, that's actually only 100 people. And the total send is 10,000. So is it actually worth building out a completely different version and going to our creative team and asking them to build a new image and a new experience just for these 100 people? And often people outside of the CRM and sort of marketing operations world might not know how big that segment is. But by going through that exercise with your user stories, you'll actually start to see this is an experience that might be worth building because it affects a significant proportion of our customers. And to take that to even an enterprise level, well, I was reading an article yesterday, it was really good, about Netflix and their personalization journey from the very beginnings of the company all the way through to the present day. And they had a really interesting piece of information there, which I remembered quite well. It was they started out building out their data science and machine learning models based on lookalikes with demographics and age. So they would look at, for example, if somebody is female and between 30 to 40 years old, then let's serve them similar things to other people who are female and 30 to 40 years old. But as they started to build that and place it against just what people were doing, which is the pure interactions, they found that there was actually no predicted power at all in what a person's demographics were. So it didn't matter if I was the same age and the same gender as somebody who might be over here looking at different movies. Movie taste is so subjective that it didn't matter at all whether I was the same age or gender. It mattered more what I was looking at, and it made much more sense for them to focus their attention on what a person was browsing and actually try and put people in groups based on behavior. So that's a good example of where you have a bit of a hypothesis about personalization and you think something might be important, but until you actually build it out and test it, you don't actually know what that experience is going to look like and whether it's actually going to make a difference. So you can try and gauge the potential uplift here of all your different stories, but be prepared to be wrong, I guess, like with all experimentation and testing. And the final piece of this is going to be determining any data process tech blockers and attack them. So we all know that within every company, there's going to be silos of data. You're trying to work out, well, I need this information in Marketo so that I can personalize this particular piece. When you've actually quantified those user stories, and you might even be able to put potential revenue against them, you can take that to the technology team. You can take that to upper management and say, this is the piece that I need unlocked to be able to take our marketing to the next level. It makes it much more quantifiable rather than being something you sort of can just groan about in your area and gripe to your colleagues and so on. And you'll probably also find that although you do have a tech piece, which is going to unlock that one-to-one experience or the one-to-few experiences, there's an easier version of that you can do with a bit of manual work. So it's not perfect, but you can start along that journey, maybe a bit of a proof of concept, and start to build the case for actually getting more personalization in the future. So look for those quick wins and then you can build upon that. As we were saying, it's not something where you can go straight to one-to-one experiences. So that's all the content I have at the moment for there. I'm seeing some chats come in. There might be something on Slido as well. Amy, do we have any questions?
Yeah, we do. Thank you so much, Phil. That was really interesting. I love the way that you talked about the technical way to execute, but also how to think about it strategically. We certainly had that at Iterable. We were like personalizing by job title, but we realized that we had very few people in our data technical segment. So was it even worth building out, content for them, or do we need to like actually go attract more people, in that segment, or is it really just not a segment that we want to target and we want to target email marketers more? So I think really like looking at the data story, maybe another option there is, we have like a quarter of our database we don't have titles for. Why don't we run enrichment on them? Because then we can see if they're actually, see what the full picture of the database looks like. So yeah, I really like thinking about, what you want to do and figuring out strategically what makes sense. Okay, I'm going to share my Slido screen. Let's see if I can do this correctly. All right, you guys can see my Slido? Yes, okay, thank you. Let me move. Oh, I always lose your beautiful faces when I do this. This is what I don't like about Zoom. Okay, make that a little smaller. All right, I'm gonna attempt to pin this up at the top. Again, I'm gonna, I'll lose the chat every time I do this. You can go to slido.com with this code SFMUG June 2021. Feel free to pop your questions in there, and feel free to upvote any questions so they can rise to the top. We should have plenty of time to answer questions, but I like to have my organized tools. So the first question we have here is, I'm interested in velocity scripting, but not sure how to get started. Do you have any advice?
Yes, that's a great question, as velocity is very much a journey. I would say that you can start out with something like maybe try one of your segmentations, which is generally speaking based on little if pieces, like if person has, age of over 40, then do this. If it's under 40, do this. Or maybe those CX personas that Amy had in her example of dreamers and builders, which is just based on one database field. Maybe just try and build that out as an email script token where you can see like an if statement, and it's quite simple and straightforward. That will help you to build some confidence in the language. But I think there's a couple of pieces out there which can be overwhelming to people when they're first starting out. And you see a lot of like Sanford's posts and so on, which are absolutely fantastic, but it does seem like, whoa, what am I getting into here? So I really found it best to just dive in and try and learn little pieces as I went. Like it's going to be very difficult for you to go in and, for example, do any manipulation around dates. Like dates are complicated. So maybe just see if you can build like a simple if statement, or maybe just a simple calculation and get that to work. But I've found it's really something you need to have a little bit of focused time to practice around with. So maybe it's something around on your Friday afternoon, you might have 1 or 2 hours just to play around and learn without necessarily being held to an output. That's where you can look at the Marketo docs on velocity scripting, look at their example, maybe just try and replicate that in your instance, and you can start to build it from there. Because what I've found is that the velocity documentation outside of Marketo is very good, but it's also quite technical and it's for developers, and most marketers don't come from that development background.
Yeah.
The Marketo docs on scripting are pretty good, but there's actually only one example there that they give as to how to actually use it. So I think it's a combination of try and build out something simple, which is maybe just replicating a segment that you have. And then from there, if you have questions or if it's not working, go to the community, ask questions. There's a lot of really helpful people there who will help you troubleshoot, and it will start to click a few of those pieces into place. I think if you have extra time on top of that as well to take a programming course in even just a basic one in something like Python or JavaScript, if you haven't had any background with other programming languages, will really help you to know how programming languages work and how something like velocity comes together. I would almost say like, it's like if you're fluent in Spanish, then going to Italian would be so much easier, because you've actually got a baseline for how languages work, how to learn a language as a skill. And I think velocity as a programming language is a bit like that as well. So
Yeah.
I'm sure there is loads and loads of information out there. I can see Amy saying in the chat, there's mugs. There would be.
Yeah,
good
I'm going to try to find,
yeah.
there was a couple, we did last year on a mug called Tokens with Friends that talked about different types of tokens, including velocity. I think there's been some mugs about velocity specifically. So I'll see if I can pull those up. And Grant, you just said velocity is great for emails for multiple languages. That really makes sense. I'm thinking about so the dreamers and builders and makers, the CX persona, that was from our user conference, and we had people when they registered identify as dreamer, builder, or maker, and then we personalized their email content. And I made a segmentation because that was most straightforward. Also, we have a decentralized instance, so we have a lot of people using sending emails who aren't necessarily like going to be able to learn velocity. And now that I think about it, I'm like, oh, that was like a one-time use segmentation.
Yeah. I think the other thing to think about with velocity scripting is, if you have engineers or dev teams, like who are part of your team they could probably put this together fairly quickly, right? And then you have a template, right? So I learned velocity scripting by reverse engineering what was already there, and then
Cool.
understanding, right, like how to break it down. And so I think look within your own team. If you have access to developers, this would be right. Like give them the problem statement that you want to solve for, right? Like if language is English, then I want to show this script, or if job title is this, show this, right? Like most developers are going to be able to like write an if then statement and this what is velocity? It's JavaScript something or whatever.
Yeah.
It's Apache, yeah.
Yeah.
So like, and once you get that template, you can use that formula, right, for other if then statements, right? So I think that Sam has a lot of information. He actually has a lot of I think he's even had some webinars too. So I don't know if it's on his side or not.
You're totally right
great.
that's how you learn coding, is by like picking apart other people's code.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it is very difficult if you're going to start from scratch, but it's always nice to start with your ready-made.
Well, say
set.
I'm starting 100% from scratch. Like, what are some of the areas that if I have a problem, I should think to velocity script?
Great question,
Like, what is,
Mitch.
yeah, like where should I just say velocity scripting could probably deal with something like this?
So velocity
What's your-
scripting can deal with it all.
Okay, but I
Except
mean,
for-
like
but there's no, but,
I
there,
mean,
but there's no
I under-
connection to the website, right? So I think that that's the key breakdown. Velocity scripting only works in email and nowhere else.
but can
Is it
you
only
go
specific to the lead or the person object, or can it be specific to like the email itself? Like, let's say I had an email that I had like in the naming convention said webinar or something, and because it said that in the name of the email, it changed the footer to be like, you're invited to this event because you've opted in or whatever. Like, can you
Ooh.
customize based on?
Yeah, it's difficult to get at things like program and campaign within that. Like, I'm sure I've seen some Sanford workarounds, but it's very complicated. So I guess to add on to that as well, if you think about, if you're trying to build out a segmentation or something with Marketo smart list filters, and you can't do it because there's things like, let's say there's a calculation, you need to add two fields together, or you need to compare a date to another date. That's the sort of thing that's really good for velocity. And also, like, I know I was talking about inheriting those tokens down for things like footers and so on, but also if there's just a one-off, you might want to say, what's a good example? Or I think the actual example they have in the Marketo docs is something like, if gender is male, then show Mr. If gender is female, show Ms. You know, something like that, where you're taking a field, taking that output, and then saying, well, I want to show this if it's this and something different. So that is something that you also could accomplish with a segmentation, but maybe because it's just a one-off use, it doesn't make sense to build a segmentation. So that's something where I would say, like, look at velocity, particularly when you're starting out, because those are sometimes the simpler use cases, and you can sort of build it from there. But as you progress, you might find, and I found that as I learned more about velocity, I started replacing more and more segmentations with scripts because they're more flexible, and it's something that inherits down really nicely.
As long as you remember to choose it in the drop down.
Yeah. This is actually a
Just
good, like,
wanna-
oh, sorry, Annie.
I just want to add on top of that, the email scripting itself, the velocity scripting is actually being used most of the time to pull the data. So if you want to use personalizations and you want to pull the data from custom object, so Salesforce or CRM, you know, Dynamics, or even Marketo custom object itself, information from there, you want to use those data for personalizations. That's where you want to use the velocity scripting, email scripting.
Cool.
Great call out, Steph. Yeah.
So can you, I mean, can you essentially build whole snippets with this? Like, can I have a text, you know, can I have 5 lines of email text in a field, you know, that are, you know, the base are, never mind. I was mixing some use cases. I was trying to keep it linear on something, but like, if just replacing words and sentences and paragraphs and stuff like that, that's the most simple aspect of.
Yeah,
Awesome.
you output
Right.
full HTML is probably the best way to think of it. So where you see an email script token, you output full HTML. So sometimes that might just be a couple of words, but it could be full HTML blocks. It could be the entire email if you really wanted it to be. So you might then say, well, I want to, and some of the use cases we've had before, like to Steph's point, is I want to go to custom objects, find every purchase that a person has made, cycle through those, and build a table row until we've gone through all the purchases to show a person's purchase.
That's cool.
So that's something where, like, that would be almost impossible to do, probably impossible to do with a segmentation, because you'd be dropping in the purchase that they made, the actual value, the actual price. And you're doing that within a velocity script to just say, go to the custom object. If there's 4 rows, for each row, show the name of what they bought and the price, and then keep doing that until we run out of rows. So yeah.
Can you run velocity scripting and look at like program membership? Like, let's say you have a big user conference and you have like a bunch of pre-show events, and you want to pull, you know, each of those is a Marketo program, and you want to say, or Salesforce campaign, I guess. You want to say, like, you are registered for, I built a segmentation for this.
Yeah.
Again, not a great use for segmentation. Sorry to everybody using my instance. Yeah, could you like use velocity scripting to pull that off the program object?
So I don't believe you can off the program object. Again, I'd say, like, there would be a workround.
Sandy.
I would probably Yeah, I would look at maybe putting that into either, I guess, Salesforce or into the individual person's lead field. So velocity is
Could you
typically
look if that person is a member of the program or no?
Member, well, or a member of or has a status in a Salesforce program,
Yeah.
right? Because that's written to the object. That's not accessing a custom object. Am I right?
Yeah, it's a standard
Salesforce
object.
campaigns, from memory, Salesforce campaigns aren't accessible either. So I guess this is some of the limitations of email tokens.
You guys are definitely giving me a lot to think about. Activate will be very different next year.
But if you're targeting a certain,
I think program membership should be available as an object in Marketo.
I'd have to look at
email
this.
script, you mean?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I stand corrected. Maybe it is.
Wait, are we talking Marketo program membership or Salesforce campaign membership?
Program membership in Marketo.
Okay, yeah, maybe. I haven't used it.
So if you have like those custom fields as well in program membership, you can use it as well.
Oh yeah.
Oh, cool.
Now you're getting crazy. Program member custom fields. I love it.
I have 9,000 more questions.
Yeah, I was gonna say JD's gonna explode if you don't tell him exactly how to do this for this program.
He's like, I got a deadline tomorrow.
First question is, what is line 1 of the code? My next question is, what is line 2 of the code?
Chicago Mug. One thing I love about everything being virtual and recorded is Chicago Mug did a presentation specifically on velocity, which I just popped in there. Maybe that would be a good intro for some of us, as well as the SF Mug, where they talked somewhat about velocity. But yeah, hot topic. And then, always just pester Sandy. He's actually, if you've never talked to him, he's actually really helpful. He can come off, I know people find him intimidating, but when you talk to him one-on-one, super helpful, loves to solve problems.
You'd be surprised at how long you'll talk to. You're like, don't you have something else to do?
I know.
I got like an hour with him just out of the blue. I was like, what?
Yeah. I'm like, don't you charge people for this?
Yeah.
Great.
I can't get an hour with JD, and he hired me.
Well,
I'm too busy with Sanford.
Okay, moving on. I'm going to move on to the next question. Do you have best practices for testing CTAs in email in the one-to-one setup?
Yeah.
That's a great question.
I would say that probably with CTAs, if you're talking, for example, like CTA text on a button, that's probably not something where you'd want to go to one-to-one, because let's say that, again, you have 1,000 or 10,000 people in the database. Should they all receive a unique CTA? Because the actual process of creating all those different possible CTAs would have to be something that would be outsourced, I guess, to your creative team.
Okay.
So
yeah.
You have 1,000 a month, and then you'd have to have
you kind of mentioned that, like, oh, a girl gets a $sign and a boy gets a %. And I was like, have you tested this? Like, holy shit! Like,
we've tested something. Yeah, some wacky theory.
You aggregate up until, but you won't put a one-to-one on it unless it's a big enough cohort. Okay.
Yeah, more or less. And there are some things that are also just much easier to build in one-to-one because you have the available creative content. So like, I used to work for a travel company and we had 600 different trips. So instead of building out a segmentation to say, well, this person sees these 3 trips, this person sees another 3, it's a really clear use case to say, there's more variations of this than I could ever possibly want to build. But I know that all the images already exist because it's all on our website, all the titles of the trips, all the prices, it's all there. It's all structured content. So what I need to do is basically to just plug into that, and then I can display those 3 little tiles. So we did in the end look at Marketo predicted content. We ended up going with another provider there to actually implement that. But that's something where you have so much data already out there, you don't have to create it. And that's why it's a really good use for one-to-one. You also think as well, like logically speaking, that's going to make a bigger difference than changing text on a one-to-one, because there's people interested in going to Africa, there's people going to South America, and they are very different people in terms of the content they want, whereas changing the CTA from save now to book now to travel today, that's probably logically going to make less of a difference. But, ideal world, you test all that, but you can't test everything, as we know. You have to go with that instinct and the cohort size.
I think the overarching question, though, maybe not with, I think the CTA part might have got us tripped up, but if you were to look at, if you were doing velocity scripting, let's just take the Dreamers versus whatever the other option was as an example. How would you report on the CTA, the email success for the Dreamers versus the email success for the other one?
Yeah, I would probably just A/B test that. So take half of those people, give them like what your default experience would be, and then the other half get the personalization. So then you can actually say, this is the lift due to personalization.
Like if you're sending an email and it says, "Hey dreamers, what's up?" and then the other one is, "Hey losers, what's up?" And then and that's all you're doing, right? You're just populating the value A or B, right? Percentages or whatever. How do you, if you go to an email report, it's going to say your email, you had, 25% open rate, obviously, because it's awesome. But how do you know how many of, what if 25%, all of those were the dreamers and your losers one sucked? Like, how do you test that without doing an actual A/B? Because if you're doing an A/B test, right, the A/B test itself is like replace the content with this other content. So you're bypassing the benefit of the velocity script, right? Which is changing your
you
content.
still need to write the script. Yeah, you still need to write the script. But one of the challenges of the velocity as well is that it is opaque in that you actually can't report on this is what this segment got versus another. And I guess logically this makes sense because as you get to thousands or perhaps even millions of different permutations, you couldn't write a report for that. So if you really did want to have a report which said here's dreamers versus builders, then you could do that A/B test. And in the B version, let's say that's the one that's got the segmentation, the personalization, you could split out an email report by segment to see that. But I would probably just defer to saying, well, run that A/B test, even though it's a bit of extra time. In version A, you've just got it hard-coded. In version B, you've got the email script token, which is then doing the manipulation you need to, and then compare those two different pieces.
Yeah, I feel that justifies the personalization. It doesn't justify the
value choice.
The values, the values of the personalization.
Yeah.
That.
Because I find myself I'm using. I'm using the program member custom fields to tag people's statuses at the time that they're getting the email, right? Because the email and the content is dynamic based on that value. So let's just say customer versus prospect. And for customers, we say, you're a valued customer, check this out. And for prospects, we say, we would love you to be a valued customer, check this out. And the only way I know that what version they got at the point in time is that when the email is sent, I tag them with a program member custom field of whether they were a customer or a prospect at the time, thereby tagging out that version. But I can't do shit with it because we can't report on program member custom fields. So
yeah, that's tough. I know because of space limitations, I'm guessing within Marketo, you can't do a whole lot of that retrospective stuff to say at the time when the email was sent, and this is another thing with velocity, you can send it and that person at that time might have had 4 purchases or 6 purchases or whatever it is. But by the time you look at that report, it might be a totally different thing. And you have no real ability to go in and see that. So that is difficult. I guess that's where you just need to start seeing, well, over time, am I seeing an increase in these metrics and engagements, even if you're not doing the A/B testing on each individual one, to try and see, well, here's the uplift due to personalization. And different personalization tools have some things like global control. They might just hold out 5% of all comms, and that's always the default no experiences. And this comes to life more on the website, generally speaking. So if you go to a website, if you're in the global control, you don't see any personalization or optimization. It's all just the default experience. And then the other 95% gets all the different tests that are running with Optimizely or dynamic yield or whatever is doing that. And then over time, you should be able to see, well, here's the purchase rate or conversion rate of the global control, and here's everyone else. So then you can actually use that to value the entire personalization program. But it's a bit harder to do that at an individual test level, and particularly with an email with something like velocity.
Yeah, certainly there's balancing testing versus just trying stuff out. It's always a challenge. I think we sort of answered this pre-registration question. You talked about quick wins during your presentation. So I'm going to skip that. I think this is a great question. Can you give an example of oh my God, can't talk. What external tools would you consider using for personalization?
Yeah, so I can talk a bit, I guess, to our journey, previous jobs around how we came to this, because There are some providers like, say, for example, Movable Ink that are very big in the email space. But as we started to look at how can we actually give personalized experiences through email, we realized that you're fundamentally solving for the same thing on web or in other channels as well. And that sort of broadened up the actual providers we were looking at. So the one we used in the past was called Dynamic Yield. And they do effectively like web personalization, but they can use dynamic images and email as well. So back to that example of recommended trips, you could go and say, well, here's the code to just show for any particular person the next best trip that they should see. There are other players in the space as well, like Salesforce has a product, Interaction Studio does some of that. There's a couple other like BoxEver as well as one we've been looking at recently internally for some clients. But I think the best way to think about that is like if you can, and this is the great part as well about being in the marketing operations sort of automation world, and that you're really the person who's best placed to look at these tools comprehensively because we have all that first party data.
Totally.
I would say think about it in context of what is going to be personalized across the whole ecosystem. So the ideal dream state is, somebody calls into the contact center, it pops up and says, here's what you should be talking to this person about, because all that information from email, from web, from purchases is all centralized. There's a decision that's made to say, this is the right conversation, this is the right product, all those different sorts of things, right? So you can build this in email and you can build out a really good personalization program, but then you're going to create siloed data, siloed cohorts, siloed knowledge. And when you do want to merge that longer term with the web team, you're probably going to have to do a lot of that foundational work again. So I would say look at tools like, Rich Relevance, Dynamic Yield, Interaction Studio, Marketo predictive content, absolutely if you're B2B, because you might not have huge amounts of content. And that will hopefully solve for the greater problem than email.
Yeah, for sure. We're almost at the top of the hour. I think we kind of talked about KPIs. So I think we're pretty good on our questions. I just wanted to say thank you, Phil, so much for joining us. It's been just as a personal note, y'all. I met Phil through Marketo boards and Email Geeks and Mops Pros, and I encouraged him to apply for the champion program, and I was really excited when he became a champion this year. I really felt like I was passing forward because JD was the one who encouraged me to apply to be a champion a couple of years ago. So Phil, really exciting that it's coming full circle and you were able to Zoom us from Australia. So, this was really great. And thank you all for joining. That's why I love our mug, because we always have such great conversations and it's just really dynamic. So a little bit of housekeeping, recording and slides will be posted. They'll go up on the same page where you registered on mugs.marketo.com. And I will send them out. I'm going to wait a few days. Mug emails are still going to spam, but they're almost fixed. So I want you guys to actually get that in your inbox. But never fear, those will be posted. And as I said up at the top, I am looking for a co-leader or co-leaders. So reach out to me if you're interested. And thank you all so much for joining. I'm happy to stay on. We can stop the recording if people want to keep chit-chatting since the end of the day. But it's the top of the hour. Will not hold you hostage anymore. So thank you all so much for joining.
Thanks, everyone. I will have to duck off to another meeting. Okay. Unfortunately, starting my day.
I know. Sorry. Time zones, man. Time zones.
Yeah, but thanks, everyone. And if you have any other questions, feel free to find me on LinkedIn or Amy and someone within these communities. Totally. More than happy to look at email scripts and try and help, because I know how difficult that is starting out. But yeah, you will get there.
Yeah, totally. Well, thank you so much, Phil. And thanks, everyone, for joining.
Thanks, everyone.
Hi, Alicia. Hi. Long time no see.
Hi.